Hello dear students, you are welcome in this video. Dear students, today we are going to understand Alexander Pope as a critic. You know that we are covering so many critics in the series or playlist called Understanding Criticism and Theory, and here we have Alexander Pope. Basically Alexander Pope is a poet, but we will discover some of his views on literature, some of his opinions regarding poetry and criticism. So let's understand Alexander Pope. Before that, let's understand the background to Alexander Pope. Literary criticism, Alexander Pope, 1688 to 1744. His contribution as a critic. And very first here, let's study his life. So he was born in London in the year of Glorious Revolution. Now Glorious Revolution is a different kind of event happened in the England. What is that? So here we have a passing reference to this Glorious Revolution, and I will explain what is that Glorious Revolution. This Glorious Revolution is happened in November 1688. In which year the Alexander Pope born? Invasion by Dutch and replacement of King James the Second and Seventh by his daughter Mary the Second and her husband William the Third of Orange. So Glorious Revolution is nothing but the replacement of King James the Second by his daughter Mary the Second and her husband William the Third of Orange. And there we find that the exchange of throne has happened, and this event is called as Glorious Revolution. Here you see the picture carved of this Glorious Revolution, where Dutch army entered on the land of England, and here we find the seashore and so many people gathered there. Let's come back to the life of Alexander Pope. His father was Alexander, a well-established linen merchant. Yes, his father's name also was Alexander and his mother's name was Edith. Both were Catholics, and due to his Catholicism he has to suffer from many things in the society. He was taught by his aunt and then he went to Twyford School in 1698-99, and his education also was affected by the Test Acts. Now what were those Test Acts? In Test Acts there were so many bans on the Catholics. For example, they could not go to the schools, well-established schools. They could not enter into the universities. They were banned from the taking or holding high office in the public. So they were prohibited in many ways, and due to the same thing he was Alexander Pope was affected, and his education he had to complete at home. His aunt taught him, but still he read a lot: Horace, Juvenal, Homer, Virgil, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Dryden. So he was a voracious reader, and hence he could read so many great authors or classical authors like Horace, Virgil, Chaucer, Shakespeare, Dryden, and based on those readings we find his views were cultivated highly, and hence he could write so great poetry in English literature. He studied languages like French, Italian, Latin and Greek, so he was well versed in all those languages. He studied the classics of those languages and learned or studied those languages at his home. He was suffered from health issues. He detected the pot disease. It means that tuberculosis of spine, and because of this disease he could not raise beyond the height of 4.5 feet. So just he was a dwarf of 4.5 feet, but as a literary person his stature was very high. His personality is hailed high in English literature. He remained unmarried but have female friends. So there was some controversies regarding his marriage, or in the whole life he remained unmarried. He did not marry, but still he has female friends, and it is considered that Martha Blount, one of his friends, was his lover. So he died at his villa in Twickenham, surrounded by friends, on 30th May 1744 and buried in St. Mary's Church at Twickenham. So dear students, he was died surrounded by his friends. So this is very important because he had many friends and he was very famous among his friends. His villa at Twickenham is also a thing of beauty because it has been reconstructed by government there, and it is now open for public entrance, and it is announced as heritage there. He designed this villa on his own, and it was a very beautiful thing. He constructed some grottos there. Grottos means the small caves in which you find water. So it is a very beautiful place where Alexander Pope lived, and it is now announced as a heritage there, and people go to visit his villa in Twickenham. So it was the life of Alexander Pope. Alexander Pope basically was a poet. He wrote famous poetry. He also was a critic, and in this video we are talking about Alexander Pope as a critic. So let's understand his major works, and then we'll understand the critical works of Alexander Pope. So very first we have an essay on criticism published in 1711. Second we have the Rape of the Lock 1712, which is a very famous poem by Pope. The Dunciad 1728, Moral Essays 1731 to 35, an Essay on Man 1732 to 34. The Iliad, it is a translation made during 1715 to 20. The Odyssey, again a translation 1725 to 26. Then a famous poem, Windsor Forest, and we have the works of Shakespeare, 6 volumes published during 1723 to 25. So these are the major works composed by Alexander Pope. All are poems, and basically he was a poet. So these poems are very famous in English literature, and still we study these poems. So here our main concern is critical thoughts of Alexander Pope, and here we have some of the critical books composed by Pope. Very first, an essay on criticism. Then we have preface to the works of Shakespeare, Art of Sinking. Number 4, imitation of the epistle to Horace to Augustus. Then we have preface to the translation of the Iliad, and here we have a statement made by George Saintsbury regarding Alexander Pope, which states his position as a critic, announced in youth, endorsed and emphasized in age. So Alexander Pope was a poet and critic at the same time, and we find the combination of these two things in one personality, that is Alexander Pope. Now let's understand Essay on Criticism, which is modeled on Horace's Ars Poetica, Vida's De Arte Poetica, and Boileau's L'Art Poetique. It is written in verse form in classical tradition, and here we have a quotation. There is hardly any observation in it that may be called Pope's own. In the words of Lady M. Wortley Montagu, who was one of Pope's friends, it was all stolen. So this is a very bold statement made by Montagu. Why? Because Alexander Pope borrowed so many things from the critics or from the poets in classical period. For example, we have Horace, we have Vida, we have Boileau. From their criticism, from their views, he borrowed some of the views, and hence it is said that his criticism is not the original, but he composed or made all together. We will discuss his views because these views are very important in the neoclassical tradition or in the neoclassical school of poetry. From there also he borrowed some of the views. Now let's dissect the essay on criticism in 3 parts. There are 3 parts of this essay on criticism. Line number 1 to 200 includes general observation of the art of criticism. For example, he says that natural endowment, training in the craft, study of rules and great works of antiquity are very important in composition of literature. Second part, we have lines from 201 to 559 where he states the causes of wrong criticism or bad criticism. Here he gives 3 causes. Very first, moral, psychological and literary. These 3 causes are very important in understanding the criticism, where we find wrong criticism or bad criticism. And the last part, we have lines from 560 to 744 where he states the rules for a critique or for the critique. Now let's understand his views on classicism. So he derives his thoughts from neoclassical school of poetry, and he gives importance to the study of ancients. Here we have a quotation: "Be Homer's work your study and delight, read them by day and meditate by night." So many things he taken from Horace, Longinus, Dryden, and we find the composition of his views in the essay on criticism. Next, we have study of ancient models and knowledge of technique, which is the basis of his critical theory. And again, here we have a quotation by learn hence for ancient rules, a just esteem, to copy nature is to copy them. So it is very clear that Alexander Pope emphasizes on the very rules given by ancients or classical poets or classical critics. He also thinks about the Aristotle. Now let's understand his views on the function of criticism. What is the function of criticism according to Alexander Pope? He says that the very basic function of criticism is to judge the literature or poetry, and here he says that criticism is an art of judging, and a critic is born to judge and poet is born to write. A poet should be naturally gifted, he should properly trained and well versed in ancient rules. Again, he gives importance to ancient rules and training, and also he emphasizes on the natural gift of a poet. So an author can be a better critic, and here we have a quotation: let such teach others who themselves excel and censure freely who have written well. So again, here we have a different point made by Alexander Pope, that he says that a poet can be a good critic, or a critic should be a poet. Means a poet knows so many things about composition of poetry, and hence he can judge it very well. And here he also provides some of the points or some of the virtues which is included in the poet or critic. For example, he should be a learned person, he should be disinterested and free from ills like pride, envy, caprice, etc. So these are the qualities of critic according to Alexander Pope. Basically these qualities are already given by Aristotle, but here again he repeats the same qualities should be there in the critic or in the poet. He must be disinterested, a very learned person, or the person who had taken training of the craft, and he must be away from some of the ills like pride, caprice, and then he can compose a good poetry or become a good critic. So here is a contradiction in the views of Alexander Pope, that he says that a poet should be a critic or a critic can be a poet. But Aristotle was not a poet, just he was a critic, and he has given the rules for composition, and here he is repeating the rules of Aristotle, and hence we can say that there is the contrast between his views which he expresses as a poet and critic at the same time. Now here is a quotation in the same regard: inwit as nature, what affects our hearts is not the exactness of peculiar parts. It is not a leap or eye we beauty call, but the joint force and full result of all. So it is very clear from this statement or these lines that we should understand a poem or criticism in its entirety and not in the parts. A poem becomes a great poem, or a literature becomes a great literature when it includes all the devices, all the parts, and when we join all these parts, then we find the composite force of that literature. Next, his views on literature. Here he gives his remarks on wit, diction and versification. First, understand his remark on wit. Here we have a quotation: true wit is nature to advantage dressed, what oft was thought but never so well expressed. So according to him, wit is the nature dressed, means there should be elements from nature in your poetry, and then you should express it very compositely. Next, he thinks about the words or diction. Words neither too new nor too old, and here we have a quotation: be not the first by whom the new are tried, nor yet the last to lay the old aside. According to him, we should not use very new word or very old word. So neither new nor old words we should use in poetry. So it should be the combination, or we should find a middle path or common or general words in the poetry so that common reader can understand. Next quotation in the same regard we have, words are like leaves, and where they most abound, much fruit of sense beneath is rarely found. So this is again a very drastic thought we find in the words of Alexander Pope, that where you find more words, you do not get the fruit. Means he is comparing the words to the leaves of a tree. Where you find more leaves, you do not have more fruits. In the same way, we should use words very carefully in composition. We should use diction with a care, so that we can make them as a whole. Next, he thinks about the versification, and he condemns cheap musical devices like equal syllables, open vowels, expletives, monosyllables or more use of monosyllables, stale rhymes, more use of Alexandrine. According to him, we should use these devices very carefully, and often use of these devices will lead to a bad poetry or to a bad taste to the reader. So these things, or the frequent use of these things, should be avoided in the composition. He is not rejecting the use of all these devices, but just he is rejecting the frequent use, often use of these devices in the poetry. Dear students, Alexander Pope is talking about the classical rules or the rules given by ancients, but he also deviates from these classical rules or classicism. How? Let's understand. Deviation from classicism. So he says that blind imitation of classical rules does not make great literature. So we should not follow blindly the rules of these classical poets or classical critics. For example, he says that it is not possible to follow the rules given by Aristotle, because according to Alexander Pope, that the literature is confined in geographical location. So we cannot have rules from other country to the another country. So rules of composition are different in a different geographical location. At the same time, he thinks about the religion, the taste of people, the taste of writer, the writer's psychology in composition of poetry or in composition of literature. So it is not possible to apply rules from some foreign land to a English poet. Next, he says that superiority of inspiration over art, and to it he calls lucky license. It is from deviation from rules. He gives some licenses to poets that they can deviate from these rules, they can deviate from the classical rules or classical poets in composition, but at the same time he upholds the rules or the ancient taste of the poetry. Again, here we have a quotation from Preface to Shakespeare, as he composed 6 volumes of the works of Shakespeare, and to it he attached a preface, and in that preface just we have this quotation: to judge Shakespeare by Aristotle's rules is like trying a man by the laws of one country who acted under those of another. So in this statement he is very clear that it is not possible to have rules from other country and it is applied to the another land or another foreign land. So we can deviate, or the poets can deviate from the classical rules, and here he calls it as lucky license. So these all are the views of Alexander Pope regarding criticism and poetry. Now, though his views were not original views, but they have combined or they have given new kind of information or a new kind of composition to the English poets, and many English poets followed these rules in the composition of poetry. So let's understand the value of criticism of Alexander Pope. So here I have a quotation: there is a little original in Pope's essay. Its only merit lies in felicitously collecting together the most important of those precepts that make up the neoclassical system. It served his age in the same way as Ars Poetica, De Arte Poetica and L Arte Poetic did theirs. Here was the genius of the age of Pope epitomized, what oft was thought and even acted upon, but never so well expressed. This quotation is taken from B. Prasad's Introduction to Literary Criticism. Now, dear students, it is very clear that though he was not original in his criticism, but he combined all those precepts, all those rules which were very important in the composition of poetry, and hence he becomes important. And here B. Prasad directly compares him with the poets like Horace, Longinus and Boileau, Dryden, and hence he says that as they worked in their age, in the same way Alexander Pope worked in the field of criticism in his age. So this is the value of his criticism, and he becomes an important critic in the series of literary criticism. So dear students, this is all about Alexander Pope and his critical thoughts. If you like this video, please press the like button, share the video among your friends, and subscribe to our channel Literature Simply. Let's meet in the next video. Thank you very much.